I still can't bring myself to look at the photos. The ones from before everything changed. They make my skin crawl, because when I look at them, I see it now. That thing, wearing my host kid's face. I had been an au pair before, but this was my first time in the United States. I arrived full of hope, eager to embrace the opportunity. The Thompsons, my host family, lived in a picturesque New England town, large colonial houses, winding tree-lined streets, the kind of place you imagine kids riding their bikes in the summer, free and safe. It felt perfect. The parents, Anna and Greg, were pleasant, if somewhat distant. Their 6-year-old son, Henry, was quiet and polite, a little too quiet, honestly. He barely spoke when I first arrived, only watching me with wide, glassy eyes. His dark curls framed his pale face in a way that made him look almost fragile. Anna had warned me in a hushed voice. He's been through a lot. Just be patient with him. I assumed it was something traumatic, a family loss, maybe. But I had no idea what was really wrong. It started with little things. At night, I'd hear soft footsteps outside my door, the slow creak of the floorboards shifting under tiny feet. When I checked, the hall was empty. Then there were the whispers, faint, breathy murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the temperature in the house began to change. My room was always freezing. No matter how many blankets I used, I woke up shivering. I mentioned it to Anna, but she only laughed, brushing it off. It's just this old house. The heating's spotty. One night, I woke up gasping, my breath clouding in the air. I swore I could hear something rustling under my bed. When I turned on the light, there was nothing. But my closet door was open, just a crack. I was sure I'd closed it before bed. I didn't know fear then. Not yet. That changed the night I woke to the sound of a child's laughter. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering. It was coming from the hallway, soft and melodic, like someone telling a joke just out of earshot. I got up and stepped into the hall, my feet silent against the cold wood. Then I saw Henry. He stood at the end of the corridor, bathed in moonlight, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His mouth was stretched into a grin, far too wide for his face. A horrible thought struck me. I had never seen Henry smile before. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at the attic door above him. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. "Henry," I whispered. He tilted his head, his smile never fading. Then, in a voice that did not belong to a child, he said, "It's watching us." I backed away, my pulse pounding. I turned to wake Anna and Greg, but when I looked back, Henry was gone. The hallway was empty. I barely slept that night. By morning, Henry was normal again, silent, sullen, refusing to answer any questions about what happened. But I noticed the way his mother avoided looking at him at breakfast. I saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. She was afraid of her own son. I started watching him more closely after that. There was something off about the way he moved, too smooth, too deliberate, like a puppet that had learned to mimic human motions but hadn't quite perfected it. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring at his reflection in the glass, whispering something under his breath. And then there were the drawings. One afternoon, I found a stack of his sketches crumpled under his bed. They were all the same, dozens of shaky, frantic images of a small boy with empty, black holes for eyes. My blood ran cold when I realized the figure wasn't Henry. It was wearing his skin. I confronted Anna, told her I needed answers. At first, she refused to speak, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee mug. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "It came back." I pressed her for more, but she only shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. That night, I locked my door. It didn't help. I woke up in the middle of the night, my room suffocatingly cold. My breath hung in the air, frost creeping along the window panes. I turned my head and Henry was standing in the doorway. But he wasn't Henry. His eyes were black pits, his grin stretching too far, the corners of his mouth cracking like dry paper. When he spoke, his voice echoed, layered, as if a dozen voices were whispering in unison. "You shouldn't have looked." Then the light flickered out. The next moments were a blur of terror. The room plunged into darkness, the air thick with the stench of rot. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I groped for the light switch. When it flickered back on, Henry was gone, but the closet door was wide open. I left that night. I packed my things, threw them into a suitcase, and ran. I didn't even wait for morning. I never spoke to the Thompsons again. I don't know what happened to them. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that something is watching me. And when I pass by mirrors, just for a second, I swear I see something smiling back. Story 2. I never should have answered that ad. It was a temporary job, a 6-month au pair contract in a small town in Maine. The house was beautiful, Victorian, with wide windows and a wraparound porch, but isolated, sitting alone on a long, twisting road flanked by thick forest. The pay was generous, almost too generous for such a short-term position. I should have known then. The Coles were kind. The mother, Margaret, was warm and soft-spoken, always fussing over me like I was her own daughter. The father, Samuel, was distant but polite. Their child, Lillian, was 6 years old, pale, with dark curls and big brown eyes that felt too large for her face. I knew something was wrong within my first week. The house had strange noises, creaks in the walls, whispers when no one else was around. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of knocking. Slow, deliberate, always at 3 in the morning. But the worst part was Lillian. She didn't behave like a normal child. She hardly spoke, only staring at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. When she did talk, it was always in riddles. "Did you hear it last night?" she asked me once at breakfast. "Hear what?" "The house. It calls." I forced a smile. "What does it say?" She only shrugged, sipping her milk with a far-off look in her eyes. I started locking my door at night. It didn't help. One night, I woke to the sound of my door handle rattling. I bolted upright, heart hammering. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Lillian stood there, barefoot in a white nightgown. But something was wrong. Her eyes were dull, unfocused, and her lips were moving, though no sound came out. She was sleepwalking. I slid out of bed carefully, reaching for her shoulders. "Lillian, sweetheart, let's get you back to bed." Her lips kept moving, forming silent words I couldn't understand. And then as she spoke, not in her voice, not in any human voice at all, a deep, guttural whisper filled the room. "Let me in," I screamed. Margaret came running, pulling Lillian away. She carried her down the hall, murmuring soft reassurances. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in sharp gasps. That was the first night I thought about leaving, but I didn't. I should have. The next day, I found claw marks on the inside of my bedroom door. Margaret's explanation stopped making sense. She dismissed everything as dreams, imagination. But I saw the way her hands shook when she poured her coffee. She was afraid too. Then, I started dreaming. Dreams where I was standing at the edge of the forest, looking up at the house. And the house was breathing. Wood groaned, windows shuttered, the front door opened like a yawning mouth. And a voice, Lillian's voice, called from inside. "Come inside. Come inside. Come inside." I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat. And Lillian would be standing by my bed, watching, waiting. Then one night, I answered. I don't know why. I woke up to the knocking, 3 soft, deliberate raps. But this time, when I sat up, I didn't feel fear. I felt curiosity. I got up, walked to my door. I opened it. Lillian stood there. But her eyes were empty, black void swallowing the dim light of the hallway. She reached for my hand and whispered in 100 voices at once. "It's time." The next thing I remember is waking up outside. The sun was rising, my skin covered in frost. I was lying at the tree line, staring up at the house. And the house was staring back. I ran. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't say goodbye. I never saw the Coles again. I never tried. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I still hear it. A soft knock. 3 times. Calling me back. Story 3. I was desperate when I took the job. It was last minute, a live-in au pair position for a wealthy family just outside London. They needed someone immediately, and the pay was too good to refuse. The moment I stepped through the grand iron gates, I knew something wasn't right. The house was massive, a cold, looming estate surrounded by endless foggy fields. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Everly, were polite but distant. They barely spoke to me, as if my presence was nothing more than an obligation. Their daughter, Elise, was 6 years old. She was a quiet, watchful child with thin, pale limbs and long black hair that hung over her face like a curtain. She was always whispering to someone who wasn't there. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I asked her one afternoon. She lifted her head slowly, blinking at me with solemn dark eyes. "She's in the walls," she said. I laughed, thinking she was playing a game. Elise didn't laugh. That night, I woke up to scratching. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from inside the walls of my room. It could have been mice, I told myself. Old houses made strange noises. Then came the giggles. Soft, echoing giggles. I sat up in bed, My breath caught in my throat. The room was dark, the air heavy with something unseen, something waiting. I didn't sleep. The next morning, as I helped Elise dress, I noticed something odd. There were deep, red scratches along her arms, thin, imprecise like little fingernail marks. "Elise," I gasped. "What happened?" She only shrugged. "She doesn't like you." I froze. "Who?" Elise lifted a finger and pointed to the wall. I thought about quitting. I should have quit, but I didn't. I was too proud, too stubborn. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, like a gentle tap from inside the walls. But it grew louder, more insistent. Then the voice came. "Let me out." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room turned frigid. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. I could hear breathing, ragged, shallow breaths just beyond the plaster. I ran. I locked myself in the bathroom, heart hammering in my chest, pressing my hands over my ears. The knocking followed me. It was in the pipes, in the floors. A frantic, desperate rhythm. I stayed there until dawn. By morning, everything was normal again. The sun filtered through the curtains. The house stood still and silent. But Elise, she was waiting for me in the hallway, her tiny hands folded neatly in front of her. "She wants your room," she whispered. I packed my bags. Mr. and Mrs. Everly didn't even try to stop me. As I reached the door, Mrs. Everly spoke for the first time since I arrived. She always wants someone new. I left without looking back. I don't know who she was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I stay in old buildings, I hear knocking in the walls. And I wonder if she's still waiting. Story 4. I took the job because I needed an escape. A year abroad, away from the mess I'd made of my life back home, sounded like the perfect solution. The Martins lived in a lakeside house deep in the Pacific Northwest, far from the noise and chaos of city life. They needed someone to look after their 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. From the moment I arrived, the air felt different. The house itself was stunning, a modern structure with large glass windows overlooking the lake, but the silence was suffocating. The forest pressed in on all sides, thick and endless, swallowing sound. Sophie was a strange child, pale, thin, always watching. She didn't play like other kids. She spent most of her time at the water's edge, standing still, staring out into the black depths. On my third day, I found her at the dock, toes curled over the edge, swaying slightly. My stomach twisted at the sight of her, so close to falling. I rushed over. "Sophie, what are you doing?" She didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge me at first. Then, in a whisper barely louder than the wind, she said, "It calls to me." I knelt beside her. "What does?" "The thing in the lake." A chill ran through me. I glanced at the water, murky and unmoving. "There's nothing there, sweetheart." She finally turned to look at me, her dark eyes unreadable. "Not now, but it's waiting." That night, I dreamed of cold hands dragging me under. The dreams didn't stop. Every night, I was drowning. The water closed over me, ice seeping into my bones. I woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat, the sound of my own choking breath echoing in the empty room. One night, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the dock. I crept to the window and froze. Sophie was standing ankle-deep in the lake. I ran outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The moment my feet hit the dock, I saw her slip forward, disappearing beneath the water. Without thinking, I dove in. The shock of the cold stole my breath, but I fought through it, reaching for her, grabbing onto something soft, her wrist. I pulled her up, gasping, dragging her onto the dock. She lay still, eyes wide, shivering violently. Then she whispered, "It touched me." I wrapped a towel around her, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Sophie, what?" She clutched my wrist, her fingers like ice. "It has my voice now." Her lips didn't move when I heard it. A whisper, distorted and hollow, curling through the trees. "Let me in." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Mrs. Martin acted as if nothing had happened. She barely reacted when I told her about Sophie's midnight swim. "She sleepwalks," she said flatly. But I hesitated. She said something was in the lake. Mrs. Martin's hands tightened around the mug she was holding. A hairline crack splintered down the ceramic. "She just dreams, dear," she said, without meeting my eyes. I wanted to believe her. I really did. The next night, the whispering started. It came from the dock, from the trees, from the walls of my room. "Let me in." I shoved a chair under my doorknob. The lock didn't feel strong enough. The next morning, Sophie was gone. I found her at the lake, standing at the very edge of the dock, the wind lifting her nightgown, her toes curled over the edge. This time, I saw it. The water wasn't still. Something was rising. It had no shape, no form, just darkness spilling from the depths, something vast and hungry. Sophie took a step forward. I ran. I grabbed her, pulled her back, and for the first time, she fought me. "I have to go," she screamed, thrashing in my arms. "I have to." I dragged her away, both of us sobbing, her small hands clawing at my arms. The Martins didn't fire me. They didn't even blame me. Mrs. Martin only sighed, brushing damp hair from Sophie's face, and said, "It always takes them eventually." I packed my bags that night. I didn't say goodbye. I still dream of drowning. I still hear that voice in the dark. And sometimes, when I pass a body of water, I swear I see a pale face beneath the surface, smiling, waiting. Would you like another? Story 5. The moment I stepped into the house, I knew something was wrong. The Hastings family had hired me as an au pair for their daughter, Emily, a quiet 7-year-old with wide blue eyes and a habit of never looking directly at me. The house itself was beautiful, an old Victorian manor with tall windows and ivy crawling up the stone walls. It sat at the edge of a dense, overgrown forest, the kind that swallowed the last light of day long before the sun actually set. Mrs. Hastings was polite but distant. Mr. Hastings barely spoke. The house was silent, too silent, as if something unseen was listening. My room was at the very top of the house, just beneath the attic. The first night, as I was unpacking, I heard it, soft, rhythmic tapping from above. I froze, listened. It continued, steady and deliberate. I told myself it was the house settling. I told myself a lot of things. The next morning, Emily barely touched her breakfast. She played with her spoon, watching me with an unreadable expression. I tried to make conversation. "Do you like having a new nanny?" She hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said, "You won't last long." Something cold settled in my stomach. I forced a smile. "And why's that?" She looked up then, her blue eyes dark with something old, something knowing. "She doesn't like when people stay." That night, I heard it again. The tapping. Then, a whisper. "Hello." I bolted upright in bed, my breath caught in my throat. The voice had come from above, from the attic. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle locked in place. The house groaned. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Come upstairs." I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the blankets. I didn't move. Morning came, and the whisper was gone. I told myself I had imagined it. But when I went downstairs, Emily was watching me. "You heard her," she said. My pulse stuttered. "Who?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked away. That night, I locked my door. It didn't matter. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up to the door creaking open. I couldn't breathe. A shadow moved just outside my room. A girl, pale and thin, long black hair hanging over her face. She didn't step inside. She only stood there, whispering, "Come upstairs." I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then she crawled away. Not walked, crawled. Her limbs bent in wrong angles, her fingers clawing against the floor as she pulled herself toward the attic stairs. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told Mrs. Hastings I was leaving. She didn't argue. She only nodded, as if she had been expecting it. Before I walked out the door, Emily spoke. "You should have gone up," she said. I forced myself to ask, "Why?" She smiled, a slow, eerie stretch of her lips. "Then you'd know what happened to the others." I left without looking back. But sometimes, in old houses, I still hear it. Soft, rhythmic tapping from above. And a whisper. "Come upstairs. Would you like another?"